Sangat Talks. Sangat Talks. Sangat Talk.
Our next speaker is an accomplished scientist, the current Dean of Trumbull College at Yale University, and a lecturer in the Department of Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology. All the way from the US, please welcome Surjit Kaur.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm really humbled to be a part of such an esteemed group of speakers. And I hope that I can leave you with some nuggets of wisdom, especially for the youngsters, and tell you a few stories about my path. And so my name is Surjit Kaur. I'm, as the lovely introducer said, that I serve as the Residential College Dean of Trumbull College. It's one of 14 residential colleges at Yale University. I'm also a lecturer in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology, which means that I teach university students. And I've been in the current role this is my 9th year, and I've been at Yale for 17 years. So I am a trained scientific researcher. I have a PhD in cell biology, and what I want to talk about today is that I've had some pivots along the way, and I think my message to the youngsters is that you do have to work really hard to, come off of Manny Singh's brilliant speech. At the same time, I think having a path is really important, and so I want to talk about that a little bit, but also being receptive to the opportunities that might come unexpectedly along the way and embracing that. And so the current role, just to tell you what I do, is that I oversee about 400 students. I'm their academic advisor, and I guide them from the time they start university to the time that I read their name when they receive their diploma. And it's very rewarding to see that path over 4 years. And I also teach a small cell biology course for 4th-year university students, so that keeps me engaged in my research. But I'm not at the bench anymore, so I'm not at the laboratory bench anymore, and I will talk about that a little bit. So when I was asked to speak today, my Jijaji asked me to speak, Devinder Singh, and it allowed me to reflect on my path from the time I was the really youngsters in the room to where I am now, and to think about all the people who guided me along this path. That was really an important thing to reflect on. And so, thinking about my teenage years and thinking about the interesting things that I have encountered, one of the things that came about was simply the question, when I know I was your age, was a lot of people will ask you, what do you want to be when you grow up? That's definitely something like, well, what do you want to do with your life? What do you want to be when you grow up? So I'm curious, are there any of you youngsters who have something in mind that you want to do when you grow up? Anyone? An astronaut. Amazing. That's awesome. Others? Don't be shy. Devjan? That's fine. I don't know is important too. So what I wanted to share was that when I was a kid, I just, I was like, okay, I want to be a doctor, a medical doctor. That was just kind of a default. I loved science. I was the ultimate science nerd. Did like science fairs, science Olympiads, science club, pretty much everything you could do about science. I did all of those things. I was also very shy and quiet and studious. And so the thing that changed a lot over my years was having people help me come out of my shell, realize my potential. And that's my goal today, is to tell you a couple little stories and to share a little bit about some of the mentors I had. And so the first thing is to really reflect on, like, who are the people who inspired me? It really started with my parents. I was fortunate to have two parents who We're son and daughter of Indian Army folks who really thought that, they wanted their children to be well educated, and they gave up everything for that generation to be well educated. And so I was really fortunate to have that in my household, and I feel like I reflect on that a lot now, having students at Yale who are first generation university students, that I was really lucky to have that in my household. But as I think about the teachers I had when I was young, the professors, the advisors, the supervisors, I've been really fortunate to find really good mentors in all of those facets of my life. And at the same time, one thing that is special that I can say to this audience is really embracing Guruji's plan for you. And understanding that sometimes things change, sometimes paths change, but maybe there's an underlying force that's making you go in that direction, and being okay with that. And I think just that trust in Guruji to say, like, okay, I guess I'm gonna try this now, is really important. So I wanna talk about the importance of mentorship and the importance of being receptive to opportunities that might come your way that aren't on that path that you have for yourself. Because I really think academic and career success is never done alone. You have to work hard. I really believe in that. And so the individual does have to work very hard, but that hard work is far more successful and goes a long way when there's guidance along the way from people who see things in your potential that you may not see yourself, and are able to guide you a little bit in a direction that you may not have anticipated for yourself. So like I said, I was reflecting on the mentors, and I picked 4 who came to mind. The first is Mrs. Butler. She was my 9th grade biology teacher. So grade 9 is when we start high school in the States. And so Mrs. Butler was my 9th grade biology teacher. She also was my tennis coach that year. She was the advisor for the science club, science olympiads, science fair. And then actually the subsequent 3 years of high school, she still was my teacher because she taught a science research course. And so there was a lot of, you had a project and you did that for the school year and you worked on it little by little, and then you went to the science fair. But she was one of those teachers who really went above and beyond. She didn't just come to work and just teach. She got at a public school, and I grew up in a small town in upstate New York, right near the Canadian border. She just tried to get us opportunities all the time that were beyond the classroom. And I really appreciate that still to this day. The second person is Dr. Sandwick. So funny enough, the science fair that happened in the community, he was a professor at the local university from which I graduated, and he was another person who did all this outreach. He was a university professor. He didn't have to do things for local high school students and whatnot, but he did. And he organized science camps and science research opportunities. But what was really interesting was that when I went to university, even though he had seen me as a student when I was young, he was my academic advisor. And so I'll tell you a little nugget about Dr. Sandwick. The next person has to be my PhD advisor, Dr. Scott Blystone. I really feel like I started to come out of my shell, when I was in high school, even more so during university, but I really attribute the person who I am today, a lot of that comes from Scott's mentorship. And what I mean by that is that I had a bachelor's degree. I was working on a PhD, but he's the one who said, you know what, before you can defend your PhD, you need to be able to fight me. And I was like, what? You're a big guy who played football, and American football, in university. And he's like, no, I'm not kind of fighting. He's like, you need to be able to argue with me about the things that you're doing in the laboratory and really defend your PhD. And that kind of push was really important for me to get that confidence that I can feel comfortable speaking about controversial scientific topics in front of a really esteemed audience of science researchers at conferences. He also believed in me in a way to pivot his own laboratory to more microscopy. So I did a lot of, just to keep things simple, looked at, in my PhD work, at immune cells, which are always in our circulation when we're healthy. But even if we just get a little cut or something, those immune cells need to stop in your vasculature and move through your blood vessels to get where they need to go. That kind of stopping and sticking and movement is really at the cellular level. That's what we studied. And a lot of the experiments he did were large-scale experiments looking at millions of cells. And what he wanted me to do was look at the individual cells under the microscope with color coding and staining and whatnot. And it pivoted his own work, and he's like, you're the one who's gonna do it. And I did, and that was really an exciting thing for me because he saw that in me. And finally, the reason I'm at Yale is Professor Mark Mosker, who was my postdoctoral fellowship advisor. And so he is someone who, I'll tell you a little bit about him along the way. So now the stories, and these are not super long, but 4 stories are back to Mrs. Butler. And this doesn't have anything to do with my career path, but this is more about my own, I think, personal path. And the video that we saw at the very beginning, it's kind of in line with that, with the big camping trip. And so Mrs. Butler, I still remember this. It was after school, grade 9, and I was working on something science-y after school. Before basketball practice or something. And she found me with my guidance counselor. I think you probably have advisors like that in your schools. And they were like, Surjit, are you still 14? And I was like, yeah. It was kind of an interesting question to ask. But because I was born in December, I was one of the younger kids in the class. And they're like, there's this camp that happens in the middle of the Adirondacks, which is the mountain range that's near where I grew up. And they said, it's 12 to 14-year-olds, and most people have turned 15. Would you want to go to this camp? I said, okay, I need to talk to my parents, but that sounds kind of cool. But that particular opportunity was one of my early kind of opportunities that just kind of, I was in the right place at the right time, and I said yes. And that camp I went to, not just that summer, but the subsequent 3 summers. And I learned how to build campfires, I learned survival techniques. I learned also just when you are in the middle of nowhere, in the woods, how tranquil it is. And when other people are doing that, the fact that you can just do Simran in the middle of the woods, you feel, it's a feeling that I think you probably, those of you who went on that trip, experienced. And it really changed my life. I had the opportunity this past summer, we were in the Adirondacks for a family trip, and I was like, I want to go to Camp Colby and just see if it's still there. And it was very much still there, and still a Department of Environmental Conservation camp, still running to this day. And I was like, wow, I have so many amazing memories from this place. And I was excited to see, my DJ showed me this particular video, that you all are experiencing nature too. Because we all have our gadgets and whatnot, but at the core of it is really, it's something that I think is really important. I think gives me peace, being able to go for hikes, and I went on like a 4-day canoe trip. I never would have done that with myself, and having those kinds of opportunities is really important. The next story is about Dr. Sandwick. He's the one who was my university mentor, who also I knew through the science fair when I was in high school. And I had this opportunity between my 3rd and 4th year of university. Still, 3rd year of university, I'm like, yeah, I think I'm gonna go to medical school. And over there, we could do university, and then we do medical school in the States and Canada. And so I was on that path, but I think my heart really wasn't in it. But I didn't know that. I was still doing the motions. And I had an opportunity to work in a laboratory at SUNY Upstate Medical University, where I ended up getting my PhD in the summer for like 10 weeks. And I loved it. I had an amazing mentor who showed me how to do like a million different things in the lab. He's like, yeah, you're not gonna get much accomplished, so I'm just gonna show you a lot of different things. I met another university student who is now a professor in California. We were both in university at the time. It was an amazing experience. And I come back to school in the fall of 1999, and I'm like, I don't think I want to be a medical doctor. And Dr. Sandwick's like, I never saw you going to medical school. I was like, really? Why didn't you say that to me before? And he said, yeah, I've seen you since you were doing the science fair. I always thought you were going to go to graduate school and get a PhD. He's like, you're a tutor. You're teaching this, like, helping this lab course. You're working in the chemical stockroom. He's like, yeah, of course. That seems like the normal path. And that conversation was the first big pivot. And it was the best decision. Right at that moment, I was like, well, I guess I have to take the GREs instead of the MCAT, and I have to apply to graduate school. But I did, and it was the best decision I made. Then the next person is Scott Blystone, my PhD advisor, and this has to do with microscopes. So I was working along in my PhD. PhD can be like 4 years, 5 years, 7 years, whatever. It's kind of whenever you're done, you're done. And I was pretty much, I was like, this is a good spot, I think I'm done. And it was 2006. And our department, this is a small medical school that has a graduate program, so not a big name school. We acquired a brand new microscope called a Total Internal Reflection Fluorescence Microscope, TIRF microscope. And what was really cool is that a lot of times when you're looking under the microscope, you're just looking at the whole tissue or the whole cell, and it's, things can be out of focus. What was really neat is that this microscope, you could have a cell coming down, and all you were looking at was the surface that it was going to stick to. And you would only see those protrusions and whatnot that were there, and it was dazzling. Crisp, really interesting pictures that changed the field of cell biology a lot. This microscope was across the hall from the student office. And Scott said, he's like, Surjit, this is a really neat opportunity. If you get to know this microscope when you do your postdoc, it might be a really great skill for you to take with you. And I was like, okay, fine. And it's like, Jo Vaiguru Karega. That was kind of that's my motto in my family. Jo Vaiguru Karega, that's fine. Because I honestly actually walked with my hood and everything in 2006, but I wasn't done. And I stayed for almost an entire additional year. And I clocked a couple hundred hours on that microscope. Learned a lot of interesting techniques, did a lot of troubleshooting, and in December of 2006, I went to interview with Mark Moseger at Yale. And I was like, this is my guy. He was someone who I still felt like I needed a good mentor, but I also needed a path to independence. And he was that right balance, and I could see that in him. Very senior professor, well-established in the field. He started at Yale a month after I was born. I was like, this is gonna be my guy. And I ended up going there and never looked back. And I'm still there. And so, the story with that is, when I started in the summer of 2007, Mark said to me, you know what, Surjit? Had you contacted me a year before, I wouldn't have had room for you. He's like, I got a second grant of funding in 2006, and that's why I responded to you, and that's why I invited you to come. So, had I not stayed in the lab that extra time, who knows where I would be? But this is one of those things that I think is really important, is that have the path. You have to have a path. You have to think about next steps, but to just be receptive to the opportunities that might come. So I worked with Mark in the laboratory. I was his last postdoc fellow. Worked with him for 5 years, and I had my own funding for that entire time, except for like 2 weeks when I was between grants. And as I was in that 5th year, I was actually sitting at the bench with my laptop writing grants for the next step of my career, which was a research professor like him. And my heart wasn't in it. Again, similarly to the medical school thing. And he comes to me, it's May of 2012, and he's just like, oh, I'm just coming back from a faculty meeting. And he's like, it's the last faculty meeting of the academic year, and we just got approval for a new biology curriculum for the first years at Yale. And he's like, I need you to run the show. He's like, I don't trust anybody to run the show. And I was like, what am I signing up for? And everyone I interviewed with is like, do you know what you're signing up for, Surjit? And I was like, I think I'm gonna be busy next year. And I pretty much lost that year of my life. We thought 250 students would take this class and about 400 showed up. But that was the year where I was like, 400 students, I got to know all of them. Maybe I could be a residential college dean. And Mark believed in me for that. He trusted me with that job, which was running the show with 4 senior Yale professors. And they were all like, you can do this. They're like, all 4 of us will be your kind of references for anything you want to do. And I was like, okay. So I worked really hard that 2012 to 2013 year. And a professor who I just saw a couple weeks ago who was visiting New Haven, he said, a very senior professor, I will never forget this, but in the last lecture of that first year, he asked the class, he's like, I'm gonna sit down and we're all gonna stand up and give Surjit a standing ovation. And I was so tired. I was like, what's happening? But it was one of the most meaningful things that all that hard work paid off. And that experience I had, I hired all the teaching fellows. I taught students who felt underprepared. I did a lot of work behind the scenes to get the courses up and running. I learned so much that year that it opened up doors that I didn't anticipate. And the final, very brief story is Guruji's plan really came together almost 10 years ago. I met my now husband. I have 2 amazing sister-in-laws in the audience. And he, when we got married, he's just like, that residential college dean position you talk about, he's like, you should apply. And he guided me and did mock interviews and whatnot. And Trumbull College is not just where I work, but it's our home. Our 5-year-old son has grown up there. It's when COVID hit, I was like, we already live where we work, and now there's a pandemic. It's an amazing place, and it's been a really amazing opportunity. 20 years ago, if you had asked me what I was gonna be now, I never would have thought that I would be doing what I'm doing. But that plan is still evolving. I'm kind of a intermediate university administrator, so I'm now thinking about the next path. So Vaigurji's always behind that, and I think trusting that is really important to all the youngsters, to understand that you have to work hard and you have to believe in yourself, but you also have to think about those people who are guiding you. And so the importance of mentorship, back to that. Your mentors don't have to be, someone fancy. It's my really formative mentors were my teachers. They could be uncles and aunties at the Gurdwara. They could be family members. But find those people and listen to them. You don't have to do everything they say, but just listen. Sometimes you will come back to that guidance later on and appreciate it so much. And the final thing is really embracing Guruji's plan. If something just feels right and you're like, I think I'm going to take a different direction, understanding that Guruji's guiding you, and if it's not the right fit, you might come back to that original plan, and being okay with that. It doesn't come easily. It takes some time, and sometimes you have to do some convincing. Sometimes my dad will still say, I thought you were going to be a doctor. I'm like, I am a doctor. I'm a PhD doctor. But I think what I say now is, I I have like hundreds of students I've had who are all physicians now. I was like, I train the next generation of doctors, Dad. And I was like, that's not what I wanted to do. And I'm really happy. And I think back to the happiness. I think we all want that. And I think figuring out what makes you happy, because, some of you have exams coming up. There's a time where there aren't exams anymore. No one's giving you a deadline. You just have to push yourself. This is all training, And I think knowing that you're going to have to motivate yourself and so I think it's really important to do what you love. So thank you, and Vaigurji Ka Khalsa, Vaigurji Ka Fateh.